Welcome to WorkBuzz's summer series. This is our final instalment of 4 mini podcasts that we're doing to deep dive into topics that move the needle on your employee listening programs. Today, we're going to be speaking about employees. So what we'll be doing is speaking to Ryan, our VP of People Science, on all things employee engagement and speaking to him about his experience after his team and him work through with hundreds of leadership teams and organizations to drive their employee listening programs. So let's just get straight into it, Ryan, when it comes to employees. Thank you. When it comes to the employee experience and organizations trying to drive their programs in terms of engagement and listening, what's the biggest gap you see in terms of what employees actually experience versus what organizations are trying to create?
Well, I think that's largely comes down to what we actually ask colleagues about on the listening channels that we're using, whether that's surveys or other channels. You know, the biggest thing for colleagues is they want a sense of belonging, right? I think if we think about ourselves as employees, what you really want in the workplace is to feel valued and to feel heard, and that creates a sense of belonging. And I think for a lot of organizations, that piece is not clearly understood, or we're not doing enough to actually create that sense of belonging. So yeah, for many organizations, it's really understanding what matters to our colleagues and getting the best possible insight to understand how they're experiencing that. And the last thing I would say on it is that sometimes we kind of build up these really big, almost like pictures of these huge, massive things that are unrealistic demands that our colleagues have. Whereas actually when you lean into the colleague experience and understand what would really make a meaningful difference to someone, it's often really small things.
Yeah. Great. I think what we see is that so many organizations and leaders are fixated on response rates. They think that, a high number, a high percentage of response rate is a proof that things are going really well on the employee engagement side. It's a tick on their board paper or their KPIs. How would you, as a consultant, people scientist, challenge that assumption?
I think it's almost a symptom of the fact that a lot of organizations are bringing in third-party platforms, like WorkBuzz, into their organizations. And so an ROI point is, well, are people actually taking part in these surveys and providing their feedback, which on the one hand is understandable, but on the other hand, really understanding what drives participation is hugely important. The number one driver of participation in surveys is colleagues feeling like it's worth their time.
Yeah.
And that confidence and belief in whether it's worth their time will all be based on whether they see the organization actually listening to the feedback and taking action off the back of it. Of course, we also need to consider things like making it more accessible so that all colleagues, not just those that have easier access to email or are sat behind a computer all day, can take part in these surveys. But we need to make sure that we're demonstrating the value of listening and showing colleagues that their feedback really does matter. That's the way to drive participation. The biggest challenge as well with the response rate as almost a key outcome measure alongside something like an engagement score is that what we measure, we try to manage. So with the response rate, it leads to people being pushed and let's not go as far as coerced, although we know that in some organizations over the years that has happened and managers have been incentivized on achieving 100% participation rate within their teams. What that actually does is it creates more of a cynicism from colleagues, and what you can also lead to is a actual lesser quality of data. Would you rather have an 80% response rate where people have just clicked through to stop being chased up and told to complete it, or a 60% response rate that's full of really authentic, honest feedback?
Yeah.
the reality is for organizations is the latter would be more powerful for them, and it would be more insightful for them, and it would give them a better opportunity to really understand the colleague experience and act upon it in a more meaningful way. But most organizations would see the 80% response rate as being more favorable.
Yeah. You mentioned there about employees feeling like their voice is genuinely heard. What are the signals, or how do you know when you've actually achieved that sentiment or feeling from employees believing that, oh, it's worthwhile me giving my voice in a safe way because, well, in a way where I can be authentic? How can you measure that internally?
Yeah, well, there's lots of research out there that shows the amount of organizations or the amount of colleagues that feel that their organization does a good job of closing the feedback loop. So being interested in their views, but also doing a good job of translating the feedback into action is like less than half. So we know organizations tend to run surveys or do some kind of listening, but they don't do a good job of translating the feedback into action. And I think where that comes from is not having a really clear and easy process for doing that follow-up quite quickly with colleagues, and also from shying away from talking about the things that we're not able to action. Mm-hmm. So being more comfortable and building that level of confidence internally for leaders and managers to be able to say to colleagues, these are the main things we've heard about on the survey. The things that we feel like we're able to action and put in place as a result of this are these things. These are the things we've heard them and we understand them and we can empathize, but actually for these reasons at this particular moment in time, it's not something that we can take forward. Yeah. I genuinely have struggled over the years to understand why that latter part is so difficult, because as adults, we're used to hearing bad news.
Yeah.
And actually, as long as someone tells you
yeah.
and shows that they have heard it or they've seen the feedback, but at this particular moment in time, it's not something that we can action, that's all individuals need to hear at times.
Yeah. Just don't let it fall into a black hole.
Don't let it fall into a black hole. Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. So how should organisations think about listening when the honest answer to a lot of feedback is really about pay, not culture?
I would challenge whether that's true in the sense of, yes, we do see a lot of people in free text comments and in different areas of the survey indicate that they would like to see pay benefits improve. And we'll come back to what organizations could or should do about that. But actually, what we know from the analysis that we do, where we look at what are the main differentiators between people who actually go on to leave the organization and people who stay, or those who are more engaged and more motivated than others, is not perceptions of pay. It's other things around feeling a sense of belonging, feeling valued by the organization beyond reward, and feeling heard and feeling like they have a voice. So we know from the insight that there are things which are more powerful and impactful in driving performance within the teams than just pay alone. That doesn't mean that people aren't going to talk about pay on surveys. Pay is something that is obviously hugely important to individuals. And so when you see those responses coming through in a survey, my approach to it is to look at, well, is this a disproportionate amount of comments than what we would typically see that are pertaining to pay? And also understanding whether there are any opportunities around it. So from a benefits perspective, well, are people actually utilizing the benefits that we currently offer? Yeah. And if not, can they be repurposed? Can we provide more flexibility around the benefits, for example? So sometimes there are actions that you can actually take around pay. Other ones, and I've spoken to a number of chief people officers around this recently, are where comments are coming through in a survey around pay, but they actually know from kind of the available kind of data that their annual pay increase is actually above the sector benchmark.
Yeah.
But have they actually communicated that back to individuals to make it really clear that the average pay rise we've had here is actually higher than the majority of organizations within professional services or
Agreed.
within hospitality. So I think the problem again comes down to whether we're shying away or leaning into conversations about pay and compensation within the organization. But certainly there are things which are more impactful from an engagement and performance perspective than pay.
Yeah. When we talk about asking for feedback, sometimes nothing visibly changes for employees, and nothing that they've given feedback about that matters to them feels like it's moving. At what point does that then impact the wider employee listening strategy and what you're doing as an organisation? At what point does it kind of fall off? And
if you're asking about things which matter to colleagues but acting on other things, that you kind of fallen into that selective hearing piece. So maybe you've already decided things that you can action or are willing to action before you've run a survey or done any listening, which is problematic because ultimately what it will do is it'll create a sense of again, mistrust across a colleague base, where they'll think, well, you're not listening to me. I keep saying it's this, and I keep 3 surveys have gone out now where every time I know that lots of colleagues have said this, but it just doesn't get listened to or nothing comes of it. That will eventually just lead to drops in participation. It'll lead to people losing any kind of faith in the listening that you're doing. So again, for organizations, it's really thinking about what the true appetite and willingness is to listen to colleagues and use their feedback to influence decisions that they make around their organization, from an operational perspective and just generally from a colleague experience perspective, what they're willing to look at, what they're willing to change.
Yeah. If you could ban one HR practice about employee listening, what would it be?
Probably benchmarking. I wouldn't ban the whole. If listeners have been with us throughout the series, they'll have heard me talk a little bit more about this in the leadership series. Yes. I wouldn't ban all benchmarking, but the extent to which it is used and relied upon has hamstrung the effectiveness and the potential of colleague listening. So that would certainly be one HR practice. And then the other one, for the benefit of HR practitioners, is allowing them to own action planning. Yeah. The longer that they own action planning and hold on to action planning is only going to reinforce almost like a parent-child culture within the workplace when it comes to doing the job of the manager for them. So sometimes HR are doing it because it comes from the right place. They know that it's really important the action planning happens for the benefit of colleagues, but it's not sustainable, and nor should it be them that does that. So for their own benefit, I would ban them from owning the action planning.
Yeah, and it also empowers employees, because again, it doesn't need to be with managers alone.
Exactly.
It's everybody's job to do that action plan. I think the best teams tend to plan together, don't they?
Absolutely.
So good. Deskless workers are often hard to reach, and they're the least likely to feel a connection just in terms of the wider to the leadership, but they are the people that are closest to the customer experience. So when we talk about meaningful listening, what does that look like for that population that are often going to be close to the customer, but not necessarily able to sing it up to leadership?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, and we've covered this to some extent in some of the other parts of the summer series, where we've talked about the relevance of the questions that we're asking. Really be quite almost ruthless with your design of a survey to those populations. Ask yourselves of every question, do I really need to ask that particular population this? Because what you need to get from them, and what we know from years of doing this, is you've got a very small window of time and they want the questions to feel really relevant to them. Yeah. So make it really short, make it really easy for them to provide that feedback, and make it focused on something that is going to matter to them. So if it's frontline workers, deskless workers who are very close to customer, make it focused on what you can do to make it easier for them to deliver a customer experience. Get an understanding from them as to what they believe the business needs to know in how it can improve the customer experience. Are we listening to customer feedback and really taking it on board? Like, really ask those teams a few questions that they're going to have a real view around. And not everything has to be a big survey to everybody. You can do very short, one question listening just with certain populations to say, look, what we really need to understand is what's the biggest blocker preventing you from delivering a great experience to our hotel guests, for example, and just source that feedback from those individuals. They might not take part in the whole organizational survey at one point, but you've still connected with them. You've still shown them that you're listening to them in a really meaningful way. So I would say, again, just that real design of your whole holistic listening strategy and really thinking about that group as a very specific demographic and being planful as to how you're going to connect with them and give them the opportunity to feedback on things they care about is the only way forward, really.
So if you had to pick out 2 takeaways about employees for our listeners today, in terms of our discussion, what would they be?
Number 1 would be, as soon as you tell colleagues that their feedback and voice matters, but then don't role model that to be true through demonstrating that you've listened, that you've heard, and that you're going to take action and drive change using their feedback, you've lost them.
Yeah.
So it doesn't matter on survey frequency or anything else. What matters is you close that feedback loop really well. And the second takeaway would be to really think about the different populations that you have. We've talked about employees as a whole group. And if you break that down into all the different demographics, you're going to have a lot of diversity there.
Yeah.
Really doing that thinking around, what do we need to ask to everybody, but what do we really need to know from specific pockets and populations to make it relevant to them?
Yeah.
It's really important work to do.
Yeah, thank you, Rai. I think a really difficult subject to necessarily to talk on when you've got such diversity within an employee base. But thank you so much for your insights today.
Anytime.
Our other mini pods in this series have covered leadership, management, and progression through an employee listening journey. You'll be able to hear insights from our VP of People Science, Ryan, and get many hints and tips about what you can do to lift your listening program. You can watch our summer series on our WorkBuzz YouTube channel or by visiting our website. And as always, if you want to get in touch with us to talk about any of these subjects, and especially about employees, then please just visit www.workbuzz.com and get in touch with us. We'd love to hear from you. Thanks for tuning in.